Ladies and gentlemen, when in 1989 the American essayist Susan Sontag published her book AIDS and Its Metaphors, a kind of extra chapter, you could call it, to her much acclaimed essay about the metaphors of illness in general, she was unexpectedly widely criticized. Though in this new essay, she did not seem to do much more than apply her already developed ideas about the way people confronted new and mysterious illnesses, apply them to the AIDS epidemic. She was attacked for being insensitive, Mandarin, and opportunistic. Surprising enough for her, by the people for whom she thought she wrote the essay. Somehow, such cool and fairly unemotional reasoning as Sontag's seemed, to some people at least, to belittle the horror of the AIDS epidemic, which some people did not hesitate in calling a holocaust. State writing and philosophizing, some of her critics said, was not the way to confront the terrible phenomenon of AIDS. Her advice at the end of the essay to turn to the monuments of high culture for consolation during the crisis especially raised a lot of angry voices. Consolation for whom, one doctor scathingly responded to Sontag. For people with AIDS, many of whom cannot get treatment, whose disease has just been demeaned as one more sign to the well and well-off of their cultural competence. For those who, in exchange for their dead, have just received a reading list for of plague classics. The nature of AIDS and its vast, almost unimaginable social consequences have confronted artists and critics like Sontag with various extremely difficult dilemmas, most of which today have not really been resolved. The most important, it seems to me, is the question of the moral responsibility of the artist. Not only does it seem difficult, or even impossible, to give meaning to a subject which seems so exceptionally meaningless, but to use such a devastating illness as a theme in such a useless thing as a novel may in these times of crisis easily seem not a well-meant attempt to give solace to the people who are afflicted, but an act of gross and unthinking exploitation. Tonight, the writer Michael Cunningham has chosen to address some of these vital questions. For those of you who are not familiar with his work, let me say a few words about it by way of introduction. Michael Cunningham is the author of 2 novels. The first of these is Golden Stage, which was published in 1984, and the second, A Home at the End of the World, the Dutch translation of which has just appeared. Chapters of his second novel created quite a stir when they appeared in The New Yorker, and the same enthusiasm greeted the book on its publication. One could say that in A Home at the End of the World, Michael Cunningham charged an old territory in a new way. It could be called a coming-of-age novel in which the 3 main characters, Jonathan, Bobby, and later on Claire, traverse 3 decades and are forced to redefine the values they grew up with, among them the concept of family. The book is written in a highly original style with a lyrical intensity, which at times, I thought, was profoundly moving. The American writer David Levitt has justly praised its ambitious scope and, at the same time, its intensely intimate character. The way in which Michael Cunningham manages to let great historical themes and literal individual themes merge without putting too much emphasis on it is, in my opinion, one of the many successes of the novel. Michael Cunningham tonight, during his talk, will read from the novel, in which AIDS and the fear of AIDS plays a large part. May I have your attention for Michael Cunningham?
Come back here. All right, can you hear me? I didn't get to meet the Queen. She wasn't there. We went all the way to the Hague. We went to the Queen's party. The Queen wasn't there. I told Anne, if David Levitt gets to meet the Queen when he comes out here, I'll never forgive her. I was 17 when I saw the movie version of The Boys in the Band, and it just about scared me straight. This was the Southern California suburbs, 1970. The new future wasn't happening there. Pasadena, my hometown, was still Buicks and tartan plaid. Most girls my age hoped to be chosen Queen of the Rose Parade, to stand crowned and weeping, waving from atop a float made of flowers. Most boys my age were stolid and cheerful as Dan Quayle and wore the same shoes. I myself fell somewhere between the two poles. I was reasonably athletic. I got into ordinary trouble with a gang of other boys, and I had girlfriends. But I also envied the girls who got to stand on that float made of flowers. I liked the idea of being celebrated, of being desired by men. I was so afraid of my dreams that I stayed awake every night until my eyes closed by themselves. When The Boys in the Band came to the theater in my neighborhood, I went to see it alone. It was the first big-deal Hollywood movie about gay people, and I hoped it might answer a few questions that were only half-phrased in my own mind. If you're straight, you may not fully appreciate how terrifying The Boys in the Band could be to a guilt-haunted 17-year-old. In the movie, as in the play on which it was based, a gaggle of gay men hold a birthday party and take turns demonstrating their crisp, clever self-hatred. Gay sex is pure narcissism, gay love an oxymoron. Everyone is witty and empty and howlingly sad. The only character who comes out all right is the one straight man who stumbles accidentally into the party, gets one good look at the gay guys' lives, and calls his wife to tell her how much he loves her. Sitting alone in the theater in 1970, I said to myself, I'll do anything to escape this. I'll learn to think different thoughts. For the rest of my senior year, I slept with any girl who'd let me. Soon after I started college, I got engaged to a girl who had the intelligence, or maybe just the intuition, to call it off several months before the wedding. I went to a lot of trouble trying to rewire myself, to invent a revised self with a more conventional future. I was lucky enough to fail. Now, 20 years later, Boys in the Band looks like a relic from another era, which in fact it is. During the intervening 2 decades, there's been a gay revolution. Since the early 70s, the love that dared not speak its name has been just about impossible to shut up. By the 80s, we had serious gay writers like Edmund White, David Levitt, and Andrew Holleran, all of whom wrote about gay people who had whole lives, replete with parents, friends, secret fears and shames, a real capacity for joy. Literature remains at the forefront of this pursuit. In movies and television programs, gay characters are still largely extraneous, even when they're presented sympathetically. Gay people have inherited the roles Hollywood used to dole out to blacks. We're usually caterers or decorators. We're usually sweet, swishy old queens who are as wise and folksy and ultimately disposable as Mammy was in Gone with the Wind. Literature, this includes poetry and drama as well as prose, has done more than any other art form to portray gay people as fully, elaborately human, as characters capable of carrying the action, of doing more than just pointing out how the drapes don't quite match the upholstery fabric. When I was 17, the very idea of a defiant, righteous gay voice seemed ludicrous. Now when I go to Pasadena to visit my parents, I see novels by writers like White and Levitt displayed in the window of the little shopping mall bookstore, beside the self-help books and the Gothic romances. I once saw a woman reading Levitt's Family Dancing under the hairdryer in my mother's beauty parlor, and I thought, all right, the barrier's been broached. But since Boys in the Band, there's been another profound change in the lives of gay people, one that makes ordinary visibility and self-acceptance look about as important as a carnival prize. For over 11 years now, we've been living in the era of AIDS. Now, most narratives by or about gay people are so intricately threaded with mourning and rage that the two emotions have started to feel like the same thing. Gay sorrow in America isn't new. Gay anger isn't either. Both were burgeoning well before AIDS announced itself. But if gay emotions in the U.S. feel especially sharp these days, it may be because, until relatively recently, many of us believed we were on the verge of joining the status quo. Unlike most other groups that live on the margins, unlike blacks or Hispanics, unlike women, white gay men can pass. Taxi drivers don't ignore us. We've always gotten good tables in restaurants. And then Calvin Klein started putting up 40-foot pictures of boys in their underwear. Legions of blue-haired old ladies wept discreetly into their handkerchiefs over the heartaches of a drag queen in La Cage aux Folles on Broadway. It was easy for us to imagine that all we had to do was remind people, gently and compassionately, that our lives are as real and complex as anyone's. AIDS has changed everything, and not only because it's invading our bodies. AIDS has also torn the wrapper off America's hatred of homosexuals. During the plague's 11 years, 2 presidents have pointedly reserved their sympathies for the so-called innocent victims of AIDS, children and hemophiliacs. Gay bashing has gotten so popular that in Houston, Texas, the only American city to send undercover cops into gay neighborhoods, 2 undercover agents were attacked their first night on the job. After soliciting the gay vote to help get himself elected, California Governor Pete Wilson vetoed a bill that would have made it illegal to fire an employee simply because he was gay. Some of us had let ourselves believe we were forgiven, even embraced. We thought we were on the bus. As the plague enters its second decade, as President Bush smugly announces that he's more concerned about unemployment than he is about AIDS, I find myself wondering, where are the novels about the plague? Sure, they exist. Paul Monette is probably the best-known gay writer taking AIDS head-on, and about a year before he died, Alan Barnett published a book of stark, rigorous AIDS stories called The Body and Its Dangers. But most of the books by gay people that are getting a big push by major publishers, the books that you could buy in my parents' neighborhood, still aren't going anywhere near the subject. The best-known gay writers in the US and England all seem to be dodging the issue by setting their stories in the past. Ellen Hollinghurst's The Swimming Pool Library, Neil Bartlett's Ready to Catch Him Should He Fall, and the recent novels of Edmund White all have been set in the pre-AIDS past. David Levitt's last story collection, A Place I've Never Been, contained a few stories about people with AIDS, but Levitt is now at work on a long novel about gay lovers set in the 1930s. Probably the best-known, most widely reprinted story about someone with AIDS is The Way We Live Now, written by Susan Sontag, who is many things, but is decidedly not a gay man. Plenty of gay writers I know bitterly resent the implication that as gay men and women we're obliged to write about any particular thing, whether it's the disease itself or just our own experience as outsiders. I understand the desire to eschew limitations. I hate to think that anyone is compelled to write about anything, but when a gay person refuses to use his experience to illuminate his narratives, it always strikes me as a waste. Black writers are more than welcome to write searing, powerfully insightful novels and stories about the lives of white people, but it seems that if they choose to do so, they're squandering one of their main strengths. Sure, there are geniuses like Proust, but for most of us, somewhat lesser lights, we need all the potency and the clean truth we can summon up. Further, I can't see a gay American writer ignoring AIDS in his work any more than I can see a Jewish writer who lived in Germany during the last World War ignoring the Holocaust. Gay men, along with intravenous drug users and members of other groups that are proving especially susceptible to the AIDS virus, have received a clear message from our government. We are expendable. A vast body of religious zealots who are well enough organized to have a potent effect on legislation think it would be better for the institution of the family if we all just perished. These are not small or peripheral issues. To write in 1992 as if our lives were just love and shopping seems unconscionable to me. But I'm not here to snipe at my fellow gay writers. The last thing I do is suggest that gay men as a body lack courage in any way. If I've learned anything in my own passage through the plague years, if I've seen anything worth seeing, it's the way gay men and our friends have risen to the most horrifying occasions as our government does nothing. As a survivor of the epidemic, I've seen more acts of heroism than I can count. I've seen unofficial families of friends doing for one another the things we thought only kin would do, often after the biological parents and siblings have turned their backs. I've seen friends mop up the shit and vomit, listen night after night to the last inchoate stories, and then plan funerals which the parents might or might not attend. I've seen strangers take care of desperately ill men who've outlived their own families of friends, who buried more than 50 people and finally had no one but volunteers to sit beside them as they die. The volunteers are always there. We never lack for help from within our own ranks. So I wouldn't suggest that gay men lack courage. If AIDS isn't showing up as much as it should in our literature, I suspect there are other reasons. I know that many of us are afflicted by a sense of hopelessness, a kind of spiritual numbness that threatens to stop us cold. It's hard enough to write with eloquence and power about the death of someone you love. Anyone here who's never written a eulogy should try it sometime. You'll see how hard it is to speak to strangers about the dead without miniaturizing them, without reducing them to papery little model citizens, trailing a few virtues and scraps of anecdote behind them as they disappear into the grave. How do you write about 20 loved ones who've died, or 30, or 50? It may be that we need more distance from a tragedy of this magnitude. There are probably more books being written about the Holocaust now than there were 40 years ago. Fiction requires a certain equilibrium. I imagine, too, that for many of us, the act of writing feels so pathetically small in the face of AIDS that trying to write about it at all makes us feel at best idiotic and at worst grotesque. Recently in New York, the performance artist Karen Finley wrote a long poem about AIDS on the wall of a theater as part of an installation called Memento Mori. Part of what she wrote concerned two men, Ethel and John, who'd both decided to kill themselves rather than live with AIDS. This is a very short passage from it. Let's make some blood prints off of Ethel's wrists. Let's take some photos of John killing himself, blow up the photo, and put some goddamn text on it that says dead, and make an edition of 10. Yeah, let me tell you about art. I admired Finley's anger and her willingness to express it, but she does put herself in the peculiar position of making an artistic statement about the futility of making an artistic statement about AIDS. It helps that she didn't bother with iambic pentameter, but there's no escaping the fact that she aligns herself simultaneously with those who create and those who consider acts of creation pitifully inadequate. I suspect that at writers we have at heart only two choices. We can remain silent, or we can imply by our work that we think we are somehow, with something as frail and perishable as a piece of paper, doing some kind of good. Maybe we're no more than witnesses setting down the facts. Maybe we imagine that through our work we can help call attention to the human losses that are being suffered, because what fiction does best is show us to one another with all our humanity exposed. Maybe we hope George Bush will read what we write and be so moved he'll go on national television to beg the American people to run out and bring every homeless person with AIDS in off the street. In addition to the questions AIDS raises about the plain usefulness of narrative art, it raises a swarm of smaller, more technical problems that are persistent and irritating as mosquitoes. To put it plainly, illness is hard to write about. Fiction, good fiction anyway, deals with the ways in which who we are and what we do conspire to make our fates. There's no place in fiction for accident. If Anna Karenina had been so distracted by her bad luck that she'd wandered mistakenly into the path of that train, there'd be no story to speak of. AIDS is in essence a runaway train. When you write about it, you risk being melodramatic. You risk ending up with nothing more than one of those situational dramas that are popular on television and in the movies. The ones that offer a step-by-step account of how a group of characters react to a flood or an earthquake or a capsized ocean liner. I believe some writers shy away from the subject simply because it's difficult on the most mundane level of craft. There are few great novels about illness. But it's important, it's essential that we see ourselves through literature at our fullest extremes of courage, of bereavement, of brutality. Smart little stories about the minor troubles of modern gay life seem about as useful these days as the lace doilies my grandmother draped over the backs of armchairs. Here's a passage from Succor, a short story by the late Alan Barnett, who before his death in his early 40s was one of the few writers looking straight into the jaws of the beast. This story concerns a man who has an extra bedroom in his apartment, and he has taken to bringing people with AIDS in off the street, one at a time, and keeping them in his apartment until they die. This short passage takes place after one of these men, these strangers, has died. There was a current trend for the dying young to request that there be no funeral, no wake, just a memorial service a month or two after their deaths. The fashion did not consider the needs of the living. It did not help their bereavement process. It was being forced to feel loss long after mourning had become memory. Even 2 months after a death, time had tempered grief to some extent. Death had been accepted, the dead gone for good. If one was not exactly over it, you were past the public display of sadness. For a while, friends and associates joked that they only saw one another at memorial services. Eventually, Kirsch observed that people merely nodded to him and he to them from across the room, and then rushed for the door afterward, like opera-goers who rush out during ovations to get to parked cars, dinner reservations, the babysitter back home. One who died in his apartment requested that there be no funeral for him, so Kirsch looked at the death notices in the newspaper and found a funeral in the neighborhood with the casual interest of one looking for a movie. Then he put on a dark jacket, a white shirt. He signed the registration book and was handed a program. He was ready to sit with strangers and have a good cry. As he looked around the church, however, he found that he recognized a good many mourners. Kirsch opened the program. A snapshot had been inserted of the deceased, a 40-ish man with a sexy bald head and sexier overlapped front teeth. What luck, Kirsch said to himself. I knew this one. A woman was moving up the aisle of the church from one pew to another. People were looking at her, horrified. She sat down next to Kirsch and said, I didn't know the dead, but I offer my condolences. Were the two of you close? Kirsch considered her a moment, then said, We met at a J.O. party. After a pause, the woman said, What a coincidence. I love Joe Stafford. I always have. And the two of you so young. During the service, friends of the deceased read a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay, Dirge Without Music, sentimental but appropriately touching, and someone else read from Little Gidding. Kirsch was in his element, although he saved his enthusiasm for the hymns, Jerusalem, My Happy Home, and Amazing Grace, for he'd been frustrated out of familiar expressions of grief at a succession of Jewish funerals. He knew the Jews at this service. They were the ones trying to look up the hymns in the Book of Common Prayer. When he got back home, the victim's family was attempting to move everything that belonged to Kirsch out of his own apartment. The police were called and stopped them. Money, the family said. Wasn't there any money? We sent him $500. He was here 6 months, Kirsch said. What do you think that went for? Kirsch saw the mother look around the room for a picture or a shirt, anything so as not to leave empty-handed. He pulled off the watch he had gotten as a confirmation present when he was 11. He pulled off a ring he had bought in Rome. He gave these to me, Kirsch said, but he had a fever. He was probably delirious. I'm sure he meant for you to have them. I know that for myself, I write about people with AIDS because I want readers to know and remember that they were here. I suppose my ambitions are less grand than those of other writers who hope their work will inspire changes in the fabric of the world, who shy away from any enterprise that smacks of doom. Of course I want to change the world, what writer doesn't? But my predominant impulse is simply to get it down as accurately as I can, to come as close as possible to approximating the living moment, to write a scene or a chapter that's 1/100th as vivid and complex as the most ordinary minute of actual life. I suppose I write about people with AIDS because they're in front of me, more or less the way a camera takes pictures in whatever direction it's pointed. This is a short scene from my novel, A Home at the End of the World. This scene involves 3 men, Bobby, Jonathan, and Eric. Bobby and Jonathan are old friends. Bobby is essentially straight. Jonathan is gay. He and Eric were lovers, very casual lovers, but over a long period of time. Eric is sick. Eric is very sick with AIDS, and Jonathan suspects he probably has AIDS too, though he doesn't know yet. They've gone out to a lake very early in the spring. It's very cold, but Eric wants to go swimming anyway, and Bobby is horrified by this. Bobby thinks they're crazy, but Jonathan insists on going swimming with Eric. This is Jonathan speaking. While Bobby got his clothes off, Eric and I stood together, nude, facing the water. We were too shy to look directly at one another, though I saw enough of him from my sidelong position. His arms and legs were knobbed at the joints, peppered with small purple splotches. His chest and abdomen also bore the scattering of marks, like old tattoos that had blurred into the skin. I held myself through a wave of revulsion, not only because his body was so changed, but because his entwinement with the disease was so apparent. In jeans and sweatshirts, he looked sick but ordinary. Naked, he looked like sickness itself. He looked as if his humanity was being eaten away and replaced by something else. I reached over and took his hand to protect both of us. In doing so, I caught up with my own gesture. I felt for him, a frightened soul, no better prepared to face his mortality than I would be if the disease started working on me now, this moment. My face burned. "Ready?" I said. "Ready." We stepped into the water together while Bobby was getting out of his jeans. The first impression was of warmth. An inch of temperate water floated on the surface, but when we penetrated that, the water beneath was numbingly cold. "Oh," Eric exclaimed as it lapped his ankles. "Maybe this isn't a good idea after all," I said. I mean, it can't be good for you." "No," he said. "Let's just go in a little ways. I just want to." "All right," I said. I was still holding his hand. For the first time, I felt intimate with him, though we had known one another for years and had made love hundreds of times. We shuffled ahead, taking tiny steps on the sandy bottom. Each new quarter-inch of flesh exposed to water was agony. The sand itself felt like granular ice under our feet. Bobby splashed out to us. "Crazy," he said. "Goddamn crazy. Eric, you got 2 minutes in here and then I'm taking you out." He meant it. He would lift Eric bodily and carry him to shore if necessary. Since he and I were boys together, he had made it his business to rescue fools from icy water. Still, we had 2 minutes and we advanced. The water was clear. Nets of light fluttered across our bare feet, and minnows darted away from us, visible only by their shadows skimming along the bottom. I glanced at Bobby, who was grave and steady as a steamship. He was a reverse image of Eric. Time had thickened him. His belly was broad and protuberant now, and his little copper-colored medallion of pectoral hair had darkened and spread, sending tendrils up onto his shoulders and down along his back. I myself was losing hair. My hairline was at least 2 inches higher than it had been 10 years ago. I could feel with my fingertips a rough circle at the back of my head where the growth was thinner. "This is good," Eric said. It feels very good." It didn't feel good. It was torture. But I thought I understood. It was a strong sensation, one that came from the outer world rather than the inner. He was saying goodbye to a certain kind of pain. "You're shivering," Bobby said. "1 more minute, then we'll go in." "Right. 1 more minute exactly." We stood in the water together, watching the unbroken line of trees on the opposite bank. That was all that happened. Bobby and I took Eric for what would, in fact, turn out to be his last swim, and waded in only to our knees. But as I stood in the water, something happened to me. I don't know if I can explain this. Something cracked. I had lived until then for the future in a state of continuing expectation, and the process came suddenly to a stop while I stood nude with Bobby and Eric in a shallow platter of freezing water. My father was dead, and I myself might very well be dying. My mother had a new haircut, a business and a young lover, a new life that suited her better than her old one had. I'd not fathered a child, but I loved one as if I was her father. I knew what that was like. I wouldn't say I was happy. I was nothing so simple as happy. I was merely present, perhaps for the first time in my adult life. The moment was unextraordinary, but I had the moment. I had it completely. It inhabited me. I realized that if I died soon, I would have known this, a connection with my life, its errors and cockeyed successes, the chance to be one of 3 naked men standing in a small body of clear water. I would not die unfulfilled because I'd been here, right here, and nowhere else. I didn't speak. Bobby announced that the minute was up, and we took Eric back to shore. I feel like I'm writing in the middle of a war zone, and one of my goals, certainly not my only goal, is to help comfort those who are dying and those who will survive. I try to write without cruelty and yet without lies, which is a real trick in this particular universe. I'm always aware that among the body of people I'm writing for are a number of men in hospital rooms reading their last books. At the typewriter, I feel the presence of ghosts of the dead and the ghosts of those still living, whose lives are being changed forever by all this death. I want these times to be remembered. I'm going to end by reading you a poem by Marie Howe, who's working on a collection about her brother, a gay man who died of AIDS. It's called The Promise. In the dream I had when he came back, not sick but whole and wearing his winter coat, he looked at me as though he couldn't speak, as if there were a law against it, a membrane he couldn't break. His silence was the thing he could not do, like our breathing in this world, like our living as we do in time. And I told him, I'm reading all this Buddhist stuff, and listen, we don't die when we die. Death is an event, a threshold we pass through. We go on and into light forever. And he looked down and back at me. It was the look we'd pass across the kitchen table when Dad was drunk again and dangerous, the level look that wants to tell you something in a crowded room, something important and can't. That's what we do these days. We pass level looks across the table as things keep getting more and more dangerous. We want to tell you something important and can't quite manage to get it all down. Meanwhile, we do our work within the time we've got. We keep the death watch. We try to tell ourselves and other people what we're learning from our anger and our loss and the upper reaches of our fear. We try to comfort one another. We shine a ferocious light. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a short break, and afterwards I hope you all come back and ask a few questions or discuss some of the points Michael Cunningham has raised. Thank you. This talk, you will be sure to be full of questions, so if there are any, feel free. Yes, please?
Yes, you've been talking about the fact that novelists have not been dealing well with the issue of AIDS, but you haven't talked about the fact that a fair number of playwrights have. Do you have any ideas about why there should be that discrepancy?
I don't. Is everybody all right? It's really interesting that you mentioned that. I didn't talk about plays just because I had no idea what people would be familiar with. But I just wrote a piece for the New York Times a couple weeks ago about gay people in theater, and it's true. There's an explosion of plays about AIDS, and you got me. If anybody would care to offer a theory on the subject, I would be happy to hear it. But I honestly don't know why playwrights are doing it. I think maybe playwrights are less afraid of kind of risking being melodramatic. You know, it's like acting for the if a novel is acting for the camera, you know, a play is acting for the balcony. You know, theater has always been better, more readily able to march in and deal with political issues. And novelists have always sort of kind of put their toes in the water. I hope more novelists will get some inspiration from the courage of playwrights. You know, who risk being preachy, who risk going too far. People like Larry Kramer, and William Finn, and a lot of people.
Perhaps it's also because of the reaction is more immediate to a play, because if you compare it, for instance, with Ibsen's Ghost, there was an outrage because it dealt with syphilis for the first time. Well, not for the first time, but on stage, so that the response was more immediate to it. Perhaps people choose that medium.
Yeah. It may be that novelists don't expect their novels to be taken that seriously. You know, it may be that novelists actually don't imagine that what they write is going to get around, and not that playwrights get the exposure they should either. But there is an immediate. Frank Rich writes a review, and there's something's out there.
Another question? Yes, sir.
Someone told me that the poem at the end of the world was written and published earlier, and then you rewrote it again, something like that. Is that?
Oh no,
Is that factual, or?
no, it's not factual. It's a great idea. That would have been really promotable in interviews. It's probably a distorted version of the less interesting fact that I spent 6 years writing the damn thing, and I'm very slow, and I write draft after draft after draft, and for every novel completed, I will have thrown away 3 or 4 or 5 novels worth of bad pages of stuff that just didn't come to life. So I mean, I feel sort of like I wrote it several times.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Maybe a little bit from the AIDS thing. How did you manage to get so completely into the heads of the characters of Cleo, Jonathan, and Robbie? How did you do it?
Well, I mean, that's really the heart of what I'm trying to do, is, to kind of get under the skins of the people I write about. Because I mean, I really feel like that's the thing fiction can do that no other art form can do as well. You can really get into the heart and soul of characters, and biography doesn't do it. It's more confessional than you can kind of be in your journals. And I don't know, it's I don't want to be saying I don't know to either no or I don't know to every question that anybody asks. I guarantee a strong positive response to the next question, no matter what it is. I sometimes feel, and I wonder if other writers work the same way, I sometimes feel like I undergo what an actor undergoes. I really just try to imagine this character, almost starting from the shoes up, and just try to imagine what it's like to inhabit that skin. I was really uncertain about writing the women characters. Male characters, obviously, I have a sort of a leg up on, but it seemed very risky and kind of presumptuous to write a first-person narrative from the point of view of 2 women. And somehow, as I tried it, it worked. I found that they seemed, I had a real sense of them. I suspect that may have something. It may be partly because, as a gay man, I think though gay men's and women's experience is vastly different in so many ways, I do think we're kind of pushed to the margins and underestimated in some similar ways. I'm writing, one of my characters is a straight man in the new book, and that's the new challenge.
But that brings up another question. If you talk about feeling as a writer you live in a war zone, you mentioned that, but doesn't that imply that your talent is in a way under curfew, that you have to more or less consciously to put your talent and the things you write into a kind of doesn't the danger of being so responsible to a cause is the danger not that you end up writing pamphlets instead of novels?
Sure, that's always the danger, and if you shirk your sense of responsibility, the danger is that you'll end up writing 9/10 of what people are writing. Mm-hmm. Which is lovely little books about not very much. Mm-hmm. I think it's better to risk being a little bit didactic than it is to risk trying too little.
Mm-hmm. But for instance, you mentioned David Levitt, and I think in an interview a couple of months or years ago, he mentioned that he was busy writing an AIDS novel, which would be very much like a pamphlet, very angry novel, and now you mentioned he's writing a novel about 2 people living in their 30s, so he's somehow it didn't, well, of course you can't speak for David Levitt, but somehow he seemed to shirk away from that. This kind of, perhaps he couldn't write that novel.
I think maybe he couldn't. When I talked to him, he told me he was writing this novel set in the 30s and had real doubts about it. I mean, David is an enormously conscious and conscientious writer, and he doesn't just write a gay novel set in the 30s without a thought in his head. But for whatever reasons, yeah, I think he's decided not to do the pamphlet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not writing a pamphlet. I don't expect my new novel to be a pamphlet either. I don't want to get too carried away with though I think politics are enormously important. I also feel that if you have too much of an agenda in your work, in your fiction, it's not going to come out very much like life, because life is notoriously politically incorrect, and very messy and full of the most irritating contradictions. I try to reserve my more sort of direct, dogmatic side for direct political action, for the stuff I do with ACT UP, for a class I teach to young gay writers. I think you have to try to deal in some way with what's happening around you. I don't think you need to, or even should, try to present a kind of moral package to readers. That implies that novelists are smarter than the people who read novels, and I don't think that's true.
And yes?
You actually teach a class for young gay writers, only gay writers?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why?
It's at a place in New York City called the Lesbian and Gay Center, and these are kids. Any kid is invited to join. I guess if a straight kid wanted to join, he or she could. These are kids who have about every possible strike against them. They're homeless black 15-year-olds who wear dresses. Good luck in the world, hon.
You say if straight kids wanted to join, they could.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. But it takes place in a gay context, and the people who know about, who are most likely to be in it are gay kids.
I'd like to make a comment about David Levitt, who I think he's in a way writing about the gay, trying to write about the normality of gays in our society, that they also have love and live and bring up children, and all of this is I think, also a very important part of the whole problem, and does touch on the edge of AIDS. And of course, he hasn't been writing that long, but he did start before the epidemic really got underway.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's been one of David's great contributions. Is he was the first one to write about gay people who live in a recognizable world that's populated by gay people and straight people and dogs and cats, all of whom have full lives of their own. I'm not, and I don't want to point a finger at David or at anybody. And yeah, he is. AIDS is creeping in, or crept into his last book of stories. But it sounds like this new book is, for whatever reason, he's really electing to not do it at all, to block it out.
But is it also imaginable that as a writer, not especially a gay writer, but as a writer, you feel in a way narrowed by not the obligation, but the moral obligation perhaps to write about AIDS, because as you said, illness, disease is a rotten subject. I mean, for a writer in itself, the effects of a disease can be, for a writer, artistically speaking, very interesting, stimulating, things like that. But as a subject on its own, it can be very difficult. So perhaps not every gay writer feels able to manage this kind of theme in a book.
Sure. I mean, technically, no one can write a novel at all. It's an impossible undertaking from the outset. And yes, I do think it's narrowing. I do think in a perfect world we would be sort of morally and aesthetically free to write whatever crosses our minds. And I know this is not a universally popular opinion among writers, certainly not among gay writers, but I do feel like facts are facts, and we're not writing in the ether, we're not writing in the middle of a void, we're writing out of a particular situation. We're writing, certainly in America, we're writing in the middle of kind of a subtle, unspoken program of genocide. And it's difficult for me to imagine writing about being a gay man, writing about gay characters, and not feeling obliged in some way to account for that.
Is A Home at the End of the World a novel about AIDS, or is it a gay novel? Because reading it, I felt it was about the fear of losing people when you're in love with them.
Sure. I mean, it's a novel about humans, and some of whom are gay, and some of whom are gay and have AIDS. You know, and one of the dangers of sort of taking a position like I'm taking, saying that God damn it, any gay writer ought to be dealing with AIDS in some ways, is the implication that you're doing fine and other people ought to shape up. You know, I think in many ways my book really failed to fully illuminate the epidemic and what it's doing to people. I mean, it feels a little bit tacked on to me, and you know, it was the best I could do. But I don't feel like the AIDS is really emotionally integrated into the rest of the book. It's a little stuck on, and it was the only way I could do it.
Well, I think maybe it's also that people have to, also gay novelists or all novelists, have to go through things first, longer period of time. When you see in dramatic events in the world class, it takes mostly 10 to 20 years before the great number of books are coming. So in the Netherlands, for instance, now books are being written about the camps in Indonesia during the Second World War. So I think maybe it really takes more time. And I think gay novelists, it's such a relative new phenomenon that books about gay people are at all printed in an amount that it reaches a lot of people. So I can see that that's easier to put it in the theater, where mostly it starts in French theaters, in small places where people just make their own plays practically. And so there, you don't need all this support also. But I think it has also to do with the writing. It needs to go through your lives.
I agree with that. No, and all of us, we're all struggling with all of our human questions, and our sexuality among others. And I understand, as I think I mentioned when I was speaking before the break. I understand that during and directly after the Holocaust, there doesn't seem to have been nearly as much literature as there is about it being produced about it today. My only concern is that as far as AIDS goes, we don't have time. This is not a luxury we can allow ourselves. It's still spreading like wildfire in the States. There's still no education. There's still no housing. There's no programs. People aren't being taken care of. And I don't know if novels can make one goddamn bit of difference. But I don't know that they can't. By educating people, by getting more people to face the full human toll of this.
It's maybe also the combination of death, which is very difficult in our society. Everybody.
We're very, very squeamish about it. Yeah.
No other ways of coping with dying, and then an illness that's connected with sexuality, and then also with homosexuality. So it's very many difficult things.
Yeah. yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, I don't want for a minute to oversimplify the problem. It's it's enormous, and a world in which sex and death are so intricately linked is hard to live in, much less write about.
Another question over there.
It's very easy to understand how much rage there must be about people with AIDS being homeless and not being taken care of and not getting the medical care that they need. But you're talking about a country where a lot of people are homeless and millions, I think, of people are not getting the medical care that they need. So are people taking that step to join with all the other people who are not getting the medical care they need or who are perhaps homeless, to think if we want better care for people with AIDS, something about the whole system will have to change?
That's what absolutely has to happen. The different groups have to work together. I like to think it's starting to happen, though it's very difficult, because the minute you get ACT UP together with WHAM, the women's group, or with a black or Hispanic activist group, suddenly the differences come out. Suddenly we start fighting among ourselves, which is criminal. But it's the next thing. It's what has to happen, because as little fragmentary groups, as gay people and women and black people, we don't have enough power. We have to band together. And I suppose the implication is as writers, we have to band together. That gay writers need to be conscious of what's going on among women and people of color and women, and the reverse. I think we need to try to write about a bigger world. Because it's huge and it's in the hands of terrible people.
Yes, not only in the United States, because of course Africa is another subject.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Other questions? I saw a few hands a few moments ago. Yes, in the back.
Yeah. I mean, as I was just, I absolutely think that everybody who's right. Although that has, on one hand, that has made an enormous, that has made a difference. That got real play. It finally got George Bush to acknowledge that AIDS exists, and I felt like Magic Johnson was heroic in coming out as HIV positive that way, and I was also infuriated that 120,000 people died without mention, and when a straight celebrity, albeit a black one, comes up with AIDS, suddenly he's a hero. Suddenly he's getting all this publicity. But yeah, I mean, I think it needs. I have an immediate in and a sort of an immediate bone to pick with other gay writers, but I think that's just part of a larger picture. Writers have to write about bigger stuff. All of us do, myself included. I'm trying to write about bigger stuff. It's hard. I hate it. Because you just see your own smallness. You see the limits of your talent so clearly. You don't feel smart enough to write about the world. Did you have?
Yeah, I only have a question. I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I just sort of felt good. You saying the things you had to say. I identified with a lot of the things. I felt that your bearing witness in public is very important. And many of the things that you talked about, I've been dealing with for the past 8 years here, in a country that compared with the United States, people with AIDS here are on silver platters. And yet, there are a lot of problems. So know there's no homelessness and everyone has good health insurance and is taken care of well. There's still the confrontation of people you love dying at a ridiculous young age. And my own feelings of aloneness and impotence in this whole crisis, rage and sorrow. And it's important that there's somebody in public, just like you said, well, finally Bush said something. However small this public is, that someone gets up there and says it in public.
Well, I think it's important for all of us to talk about it to one another. It's important to keep it alive, because I think as the deaths wear on, as we start to get sort of grotesquely good at putting on funerals, you know, there's a real temptation to kind of sweep it away, to say, all right, can we just carry on with business as usual? And I think it's important to keep talking about it through books and just, you know, through in our lives, just you know, ordinary.
I'm reminded of something Edmund White said once to me, and he said, well, one problem with Americans is that they refuse to face up to tragedy, to accept tragedy, or even acknowledge it.
I certainly, I think that may be true of humans. It's certainly true of Americans. Yeah, and I mean, there seems to be, you know, America is the only country I can speak for, and I sometimes think, we were talking about this last night at dinner, I sometimes think America gets a bit of a bad rap, and no one despises the government and a lot of other things about it more than I do. But I also feel like America is sort of the world's science project, and you know, that a lot of how Americans respond to this just incredible avalanche of goods is how a lot of people would respond. But you know, I think. Yeah, Americans certainly would prefer to be unacquainted with tragedy, and there's part of what is really sinister to me about like the New Age stuff that's very popular there, and I'm even starting to hear this from people who have been in 12-step programs, which are, you know, Alcoholics Anonymous, which are enormously popular in the States and do a great, you know, and absolutely save people's lives. But there is this there's this increasingly popular urge to kind of make a life in which all the tragedy was in the past. You know, before I got these crystals, before I gave up drinking, everything was a mess. That was the cause, and now, you know, and now I live an immaculate life, as if that were possible, as if there wasn't something wormy in us that we're always coming to terms with and always battling. But yeah, people, who wants to look at it?
Well, whoever wants.
Before I read the book, I read that newsletter, and I thought, oh, AIDS, okay, you know, the whole thing and stuff. And I was like, I got to like the middle of it, and I'm like, well, where's this AIDS thing? I got to a little bit further, and then Jonathan's encounter with Eric, I was like, oh, okay, you know, something's going to happen. And then at the end, then I see how it like kind of worked out. And it was kind of like interesting to see that last scene by the water. And also how Bobby and Jonathan actually had their first encounter after Jonathan had dove into that water and Bobby like had gotten up. That was like really, you could see the thread of being pulled together. So what were you going through when you were like writing this? I don't know how it is that you wrote it in the sections and stuff, but were you thinking the whole time at the beginning, well, where am I going to get this AIDS thing in, or how did it work out? What were you going through?
You know, part of the reason the book took so long to write was that I started writing it in like 1984, when AIDS still seemed sort of remote, when it didn't seem like I needed to account for it in a novel any more than I would feel compelled to account for wars in remote countries. They're there, you know about them, but you know, a novel can only contain so much. And you know, as I wrote the book, it moved, the disease moved from an abstraction to a very potent reality. Suddenly I knew somebody with AIDS, and then I knew 5 people, and then I knew 10 people. And I kept struggling to find a way to include that. And as I've said, I'm not totally satisfied with the way I did, but I kept trying to lump it on in some way, and it felt lumped on, and it still feels lumped on a little bit. But I tried to hide the stitching as best I could.
I just wanted to ask what writers do you feel most influenced you, not for this particular book, but in general as a novelist?
Well,
Who are your heroes?
well, my hero, and it always seems a little presumptuous to cite the great writers. I mean, I sort of feel like a fish who's saying he was most influenced by the ocean. But, Flaubert makes me insane. I think Madame Bovary was the first real book I ever read, because I grew up in Southern California in the late 60s, and I had this kind of faux education that was really about rock lyrics. It was back when they sort of gave us the education we thought we needed. And the best book I'd ever read was The Grapes of Wrath. I thought that was about as good as it got. And somebody gave me Madame Bovary. And I thought, it has a painting on the cover. It kind of made me nervous. And I read it, and it set the ends of my hair on fire. It really did change my life. I don't think that's an overstatement. So I mean, if I have an angel, kind of hovering over me, it's that nasty old Gustave Flaubert sitting writing for 18 hours at a stretch and getting piles and hemorrhoids. Terrible life, but he produced that book. And there are other people I love whose work is so different from mine. It's hard to imagine that they're influenced. But Flannery O'Connor, Dennis Cooper. A lot of, and it keeps changing. There's always somebody new who knocks me out. There's a new writer named Bernard Cooper who's really remarkable. A lot of people.
Yes?
Oh, it's not. No, it's not forbidden. No. Well, yes, it depending on the circumstances. It's pretty thoroughly forbidden in the schools. This is this kind of outlaw operation that is not under any kind of constraints like that. Though these kids are real hip. These kids can teach me things about that. I teach them about writing. They teach me about fashion, and they know what they're doing. They're not taking risks. But they're the exception. They're the ones who live this life on the outside, and this body of information they have, the kind of knowledge other kids are getting in school, they're not getting because they're just too weird for school. They just But no, it's not forbidden. No, it's not.
Any other question? Yes, at the back.
Well, I see your choice of writing about AIDS as the one which made, for example, certain writers in history. For example, Albert Camus wrote about the plague. So, to what extent? I mean, can you accept this comparison between you and Albert Camus, for example?
I'm not. Let me make sure I understood the question.
Your responsibility as a writer has put you in front of a choice, and you have chosen to write about AIDS.
Yeah.
As Albert Camus, for example, some years ago, he has also chosen to write about the plague.
Right.
So to what extent do you see this responsibility?
Does it make me nervous for being in the same room with Camus? Oh, sure, but whenever you're trying to write, it's probably better not to think about all the geniuses who have done and what they've done with a simple pen and paper. Whether it's Faulkner hanging over your head or Camus, whatever you're trying to do, there is somebody who's already done it 10 times better than you'll ever do it. It almost seems like you have to have a certain cultivated stupidity to be a novelist, because you just do it anyway. You just keep banging away at it, even though there have been people ahead of you who staked out this turf and done this miraculous job of it. You just do it anyway.
Well, I think I want to thank you now, and thank you for your participation. And I give to Ellen.
Well, thank you very much for having been here. Thank you, Michael Cunningham and Bas Heijne, for this, in a way, at least to me, emotional evening, you could say. Thank you for having been here, having been at the lecture series American Literature Today. This is the end, the grand finale of the third series. The next series will start in September. I thank Babette a lot, who has been my assistant for a year, and she is leaving for another job. And we have invited quite some authors. David Levitt is coming for certain in December. The other authors we have invited, they are in a piece of paper. You can take it with you. You can look at it. But the newsletter will keep you informed. Nobody, apart from a few people, Norman Mailer, Jane Ann Phillips, and Tim O'Brien, have said they would feature in the next series, but we don't know yet when. Thank you very much for having been here, and we hope to see you again next season. Thanks.